All right, and we are live. We're live, guys. Good morning. Welcome to another episode of Good Morning Liberty. Happy October. It's October 1st, Monday morning, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time, here from the West Coast in downtown Los Angeles, where I, Michael Boldin, am broadcasting live from my home studio here, the 10th Amendment Center. And I really appreciate you being with me here today. I apologize. I got the stream started a little bit late. They're doing some heavy machinery right outside the window for a couple of weeks in a row here. So luckily, I think they wrapped that all up. I apologize in advance if we get a couple of noise interruptions. But hopefully I talk loud enough and constantly enough to fill this space. But today I want to talk about the Supreme Court circus. Good morning to EHP Training LLC, and of course, anyone who else is watching, either live or here in the archive. Reminder, smash those like buttons, leave some comments, hit subscribe. It really helps us out. But we want to talk about today, my idea was to talk about the Supreme Court. I know a couple of weeks ago in early September, I did an episode basically calling Brett Kavanaugh a swamp creature. No, rather than talking specifically about him, I want to talk more generally about the Supreme Court. I had done another episode where I had gone through an article by Chris Ann Hall, which covered basically the duties of a Supreme Court justice. And that's really all about following the Constitution. And what we have today, because the Supreme Court has been put in a place where 9 people, and in many situations, 1 person, dictates the role of government and the fate of liberty for hundreds of millions of people. Of course, instead of having a nomination hearing, it's going to be a circus because so much is at stake. And even if the individual that's being nominated is palatable to both political teams that are in power in Washington, D.C., they will still make it a rallying cry because there is so much power in Washington, D.C., and they need to do this to rally the troops for other issues. Fundraising for the election campaign, the votes that are coming in November. So it's turned from a nomination hearing to a circus, in my view, primarily because there's way too much power centralized in Washington, D.C. Now, the article that I want to cover today is actually done by someone who I would say had probably more influence on me than anyone in my transition to being a big government leftist to whatever I am today. To me, I've often said all I am is just me and I want to live free. Some people say libertarian, some people say anti-government, some people say all kinds of different things. Constitutionalist, whatever it may be. I don't care how it's defined. But I definitely went through a transition where I personally thought the solution to every problem was a government solution. That's what happens when you go to government-run schools. People get inundated with this at a very early age, and it's hard to shake that. So one person who helped me get through that, rest in peace, was a great libertarian writer named Harry Browne, and he was a longtime columnist and investment advisor. He wrote a book all the way back in the 70s called How to Profit from the Coming Devaluation. I think this is where he made his mark. Before my time, as far as reading goes, I was born in the early 70s, but as far as reading goes, I definitely was not on board with that already. That would be amazing, though, if I was. And so he was recognizing that finally taking the U.S. government off the gold standard, closing that gold window that Nixon did, was going to result in an upswing in profits for people who played it smart. So he wrote a book about that. He also wrote a book called How to Live Free in an Unfree World, which I think is kind of a self-help book on how to find freedom when there's so much tyranny and government control around us. And he wrote tons of columns. He actually ran as a Libertarian Party candidate back in 96 and 2000. Unfortunately, since his time, and then Michael Badnarik was the guy after that, they've basically nominated these kind of big government Republican-type guys to be their standard bearer. I mean, Gary Johnson isn't necessarily a big government Republican guy, but they're basically going for the Republican governor guy. This new one, I think, is going to be Bill Weld, and he's been bad on everything from guns to war powers and all across the board on a lot of stuff. So Harry, I think, was very influential on my thinking. He took while he may have been a libertarian at heart and he wanted more liberty in all situations, I think he recognized strategically that his role, if he was running to be president, was to follow the Constitution. So he spent a lot of time talking about the Constitution and its relationship to liberty and vice versa. And one article that he wrote back in 2000, and I think I probably didn't read this until a few years after that, is he used to write a column at WorldNet Daily when I think they had a broader range of opinion being published there. And he wrote this column during the Bush-Gore, I think it would have been, Bush versus Gore campaign. And basically he's talking about in this article how everybody's after one side or the other, how if you don't elect this team or that team, you're going to end up with the opposite team's Supreme Court justices, and this is all going to be bad. So he put together this article. It says, hey, if I'm elected president, these are 6 questions that I will ask any Supreme Court nominee or potential Supreme Court justice, federal court. I guess it could apply to any federal court position. And the questions then, I believe, are timeless. They could be used at any time. And that was, to me, one of the greatest impacts of Harry Browne's writings, was that a lot of what he wrote, even if he was writing about current events, he would put timeless principles that could be applied no matter now that he's passed for a number of years, and it's not Bush versus Gore, but it's the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, the questions still are valid. EHP Training says that's what's wrong with attorneys. They go to schools taught by attorneys who teach constitutional law rather than teach the Constitution as law. And I haven't read it yet, but Mike Meharry, who is our National Communications Director, he said he sends out a weekly email with a blog post in it called like Monday Musings or something like that. And he's basically talking about how everyone is JD impaired. These federal judges are JD impaired. They're basically learning everything from precedent's sake. And all they care about is precedent. They really don't learn about the founding document, what the legal meaning of the original Constitution is. And therefore, they never actually apply that to the cases. They only look at precedent. So when precedent is bad, then everyone else gets screwed. Dan Warsaw, I'm taking my break here on TAC in an attempt to escape the insanity. EHP Training is spot on. Yeah, and that's, I would go to, it's Michael Meharry, MAHARREY.com. I will see if I can add a link here. I know he just posted on his Facebook. Well, just do a search for Michael Meharry. He just did this email blast this morning. He posted on his website. We generally cross-post to the 10th Amendment Center blog over generally 1 to 3 days later. So you'll see that post as well. But let's get into this article from Harry Browne, which I think is really, really insightful. He called it the Supreme Court scam. And he, like I was saying, he basically talks about how Republicans have been explaining to us that small government advocates, why we should vote for George W. Bush. And then, of course, the Gore people were saying, well, this is why you got to vote for Gore. And it's this constant battle. And it's still playing out today, almost the same. It just is ramped up in the insanity, and I think social media helps amplify that. And in a way, some people might say, well, social media is making things worse. But I think, in a way, it's also pointing out the dangers inherent in the system, that there's so much power. This circus is going to happen. It creates a mockery of the entire system. Well, it's a bad situation. So let's go through these questions. So he says, every modern Supreme Court justice decides constitutional questions by referring to something other than the plain language of the Constitution. They invoke original intent, a living Constitution, penumbras. That must have been something from the time. I'm not familiar with that one. The greater good, or the compelling interest of government. They do talk about that pretty regularly. In so doing, they demonstrate that they are unqualified to sit on the Supreme Court. So he goes through what the First Amendment says, and that's his setup. And he's talking about reading the Constitution itself. So his first question, the first question I would pose to any potential Supreme Court judge is, 1, can you read? Now, if the prospect can pass a reading test, we can move on to the second question. What do the words Congress shall make no law. Now, mind you, he was talking about the First Amendment. Shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, etc., etc. And then he goes into the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. He says, again, no exceptions or qualifications are given. So my next question is, number 3, what do the words shall not be infringed mean? And going from there, question 4, do the thousands of gun laws now on the books infringe in any way whatsoever on the right of the people to keep and bear arms? Now, if I were, you could literally pick out any amendment and do the same thing. Can you read? Do you know what these words are? What does shall not be infringed? Congress shall make no law. Or with Brett Kavanaugh, if we want to get more specific, and I covered this in my episode back on September 7th, I think it was. You can scroll through. We actually created a playlist here on YouTube that has just the Good Morning Liberty shows. We try to separate all of our video types into playlists to make it a little bit easier. And in that one, I talked about his views on the Fourth Amendment, which are horrible. Clearly, the man can read. The man can write. He can talk. He can show outrage. I mean, he can do all the things that you'd want someone in a leadership role to take. But as far as the Fourth Amendment, he's horrible. He helped pass the Patriot Act. He argued in favor of Section 215. And then some people were saying, oh, he was just doing his job as the government lawyer for the Bush administration, getting that through. But years later, 7 years later in 2015, sitting as a federal judge, he argued that it doesn't violate the Fourth Amendment. And he said, even if it does, there's a compelling government interest to do this, to protect us from terrorists. So unlimited NSA spying under Section 215 of the Patriot Act is okay to Brett Kavanaugh. I don't want to make this episode really about him, but the general questions that come up from Harry Brown that I think apply across the board. Mihail Osman says, would you support the amendment that each state appoints one judgment to the Supreme Court? I'm not actually trying to get any amendments passed personally. I know some people are trying to get things repealed. I'm too busy trying to nullify everything on the books already, and I don't see amendments as an immediate solution, maybe in the long run. Taco Salad. The nonsense of not answering questions needs to end. I have not been watching, so I guess it's possible that they've just been horrible on this. Or I don't know. But that's what politicians do. They obfuscate. They skip around. Will Johnson, universal laws. Do we have rights before the Bill of Rights? Yes, of course. I'm sorry, I'm doing the ignoring some of the questions because Will put 3 in a row there. So I think they led up to that one. Do we have rights before the Bill of Rights? And of course, our rights, our natural rights, they cannot be given or taken away by government. They can be interfered with. And that was the whole goal of putting in the Bill of Rights. It was recognizing that these particular rights, although the Ninth Amendment said this should not be seen as a definitive list of all of our rights, these are so important that we really want to hammer home that the federal government should not be involved in interfering with these. So, EHP training, absolutely. Gun control is not an enumerated power delegated to the federal government. And I don't know if anybody knows, has Brett Kavanaugh been asked about the right to keep and bear arms? I had someone tweet at me personally and then also at our 10th Amendment Center account because we were pointing out how bad Kavanaugh is on the Fourth Amendment and war powers, probably a few other things as well. But they said, well, you're always going to get somebody bad. You know, this is the best we got. He's 99% on as far as the Second Amendment. And to me, that sounds like a pretty radical claim because as EHP training points out, gun control is not an enumerated power delegated to the government. They don't have any authority to have any gun control. And if we want to pretend, like many people do, that there is no gun control on the books now, then of course someone can be 99%. But is someone asking Brett Kavanaugh, is the National Firearms Act of 1934 unconstitutional? The answer should be yes. unqualified. Is the Gun Control Act of 1968 unconstitutional? The answer should be yes, unqualified. Same with the amendments in 1986, and same with the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988. Oh, taco salad was okay, that helps. I was talking about the nonsense of not answering questions. Although I did it myself with Will, I apologize. But referring to Supreme Court nominees not answering questions during the confirmation process. And I'm glad I'm not watching it other than reading through some sections, getting some quotes. I'm trying to make sure that I'm sticking to the issues that I find are important, the Constitution. Because as the episode when we covered Chris Ann Hall's article, the job of a Supreme Court justice is to uphold the Constitution and nothing else. Now, just like any job interview, and really that's what it is, I think it's valid to bring up moral and personal character. I have no idea what his history is as a kid. I'm not spending time doing like O.J. Simpson trial type of research. I'm not interested in it. I'm not going to. And the reason is that I wouldn't go to the next level is because I don't feel the guy passes constitutional muster first. The first thing is find someone that is 100% on the Constitution, and we're not going to get that. I would take at this point probably, I don't know, 70%. The biggies, war powers, the right to keep and bear arms, the right to privacy, the Fourth Amendment, the First Amendment, these all have to be spot on for me to even care about anything else about the person's life or character to decide that I would support them for the Supreme Court. Hi to Justin Bayola. Sorry I'm late. Okay, hit like in the archives. That definitely helps out. That definitely helps out. I appreciate everyone being here. So we're going through, to those who have jumped in late, we're going through an article from someone that I admired while he was alive that helped me learn a lot about the Constitution and liberty, a man named Harry Browne, who wrote a lot of books and articles throughout his life. And he wrote back in early September of 2000, an article called The Supreme Court Scam, which I have up here if my software switches. Thank you, Wirecast. And he's asking, he wrote this article asking 6 questions. What he would do if he was elected president. What questions would he ask anyone looking to be a Supreme Court justice? And it's applicable at all times. He really focused heavily on the right to keep and bear arms, but we could apply the same thing to the text of the Fourth Amendment. Can you read? What do these words mean? Have you read them? Is there anything on the books that violate this right now? Whether it's the gun control laws and regulations that I mentioned, or the Patriot Act, NSA spying, the DEA program that taps into states' license plate readers that are all around the country that has been going for almost 10 years now. It was discovered after 8. The TSA Quiet Skies program, where they're monitoring people's behaviors and even putting federal marshals onto flights to follow people. So not with a warrant, without a warrant. So they're not following the rules of the Constitution. So let's go back to number 4. Do the thousands of gun laws now on the books infringe in any way whatsoever on the right of the people to keep and bear arms? And that's where I went into my rant about all these federal gun control measures on the books. I know the states have a ton of them too. There are so many states that are awful on our natural right to keep and bear arms. But talking about the Second Amendment and the federal gun control, this is a timeless question because nothing has changed. We have the Republican Congress and an NRA-backed president, and no one is talking about getting rid of all the federal gun control that already exists. So Harry goes on to talk about the Ninth Amendment, and he says, his next question, number 5, what rights do the people no longer have? Because the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. What rights do people no longer have, and where in the Constitution were those rights taken from the people? And then he goes into his last question. And like I said, he taught me quite a bit. And he used the 10th Amendment oftentimes as a foundation. He reads to the 10th, which I think is appropriate. Seeing this is the 10th Amendment Center's broadcast right here. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. I think it's 28 words. So Harry's final question is number 6. Where in the Constitution was it delegated to the United States government the power to interfere in education, healthcare, law enforcement, welfare, charity, corporate welfare, or any of the many other areas that form a part of today's overbearing, overregulating, overexpensive federal government? And we can ask those same questions today. I think the last one, of course, it resonates the most to me because instead of just focusing on one issue, so many people are single issue voters or single issue activists. And while there is a great value in working with them on a single issue, and think about it, our lives are busy. The more they destroy the dollar through the Federal Reserve, the harder we have to work. You look at a society that decades ago only required one breadwinner in a family. Well, that is not very possible for most people today. It does require multiple incomes. It's a step backwards because they keep destroying the value, our purchasing power, while they keep handing off the inflation tax to their backers. So a lot of people have to just focus on one issue, and I actually encourage people to do this. Hey, if you don't have a lot of time, pick what's most important to you, one or two things, and spend your energy on that. That helps advance liberty. It helps advance the original meaning of the Constitution, and it's a net gain for society. For me, I work on the 10th Amendment at the 10th Amendment Center. That is my thing. So I always try to look at the overarching, the all-encompassing view. And that's what Harry Browne was talking about here. Hey, where does the federal government have the power? And this is back in 2000, 18 years later, and the same things are happening. This was just getting out of the Clinton years. So from Clinton to Bush, Bush's second term, Obama, Obama's second term, and now Trump. And there is no difference in what that question could be. Let's look at it one more time because I think it's a big deal. And it says a lot about the strategy that people have been employing, which is go to the federal courts in the hopes that federal courts will limit federal power, protest in Washington, D.C. in the hope that you will be able to beg federal politicians to limit their own power, or vote the bums out in the hopes that the new bums are going to say, oh, all that federal power you've left for me, well, I don't need it. None of those are working 18 years later, and you probably could go further back. Where in the Constitution was it delegated to the United States government the power to interfere in education, healthcare, law enforcement, welfare, charity, corporate welfare, or any of the many other areas that form a part of today's overbearing, overregulating, overexpensive federal government? And Harry said, those 6 questions will tell me all I need to know about the kind of judge a potential nominee would be. And I think the same thing applies today. So lots of interesting comments here. Taco Sal, the scary thing is Yale is pumping out these living document type lawyers. I think most of them have that view. I mean, you could even look at a guy that people looked at as being originalist, Scalia. They keep telling us we want another judge in the mold of Scalia. I do not, personally. I want a judge who follows the Constitution. That's it. Scalia was happy to set aside the Constitution in a living document approach when the issue didn't fit with his conservative political viewpoints. And that is the famous case in 2005 of Gonzalez versus Raich. A lady, Angel Raich, was using marijuana in Northern California. Her and her caregiver were growing 6 plants in their backyard in Northern California under California's medical marijuana law at the time. Well, the DEA called the local sheriff's office and they partnered up and came in and destroyed her plants. They literally stomped out her plants in front of her. So she sued. She took it to the Supreme Court. And when it got to the Supreme Court, she ends up losing. And Justice Scalia, Clarence Thomas wrote in dissent, but Scalia said that growing 6 plants in your backyard, never buying or selling them, consuming them in your own home, counted as interstate commerce. And the federal government could therefore regulate, control, or completely ban your activity or the plant that you were growing. Now, you can apply this to just about anything else. And of course, what happened when the Obamacare case came up? Liberals who love this type of view, this expansive view, this ever-changing living document view of the Constitution, they heavily cited Justice Scalia and his statements to back up Obamacare. Because when you turn a blind eye, and I talked about this on the anniversary of George Washington's farewell address, if you turn a blind eye to the original meaning of the Constitution, you allow violations or you allow more government power because you might like the outcome today. And many conservatives at the time did like the outcome. Many others did not. But the ones who did, that was used against them years later in Obamacare. It's very, very dangerous. Will Johnson is correct. Folks truly need to understand federalism. Justin, there is no such thing as a judge who follows the Constitution. There might be some out there. I haven't studied them all, but like anyone who gets to a level of prominence tends to be really, really bad. Sometimes they'll do a good thing on one issue or another, but in general, when it comes to the Constitution, they do a really bad job. So wrapping it up here on Harry's article, he says, phrases like make no law or shall not be infringed or retained by the people or reserved to are comprised of everyday words that require no search for original intent or penumbras. The Constitution means what it says it means, or it means nothing at all. And any judge who overrules the plain English of the Constitution is no judge at all, whether he's been appointed by a Republican or a Democrat. And the same thing applies today. So whether it's the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, war powers, or anything in between, the goal is the Constitution, not to have more power in the Supreme Court. So that leads me to the quote of the day that I thought was very applicable. It really is from an article that we sent out to our email newsletter over the weekend. If you're not signed up, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/register. Sometimes, even if you're getting our daily updates, or you sign up to get our RSS feed or follow our social media, you're not going to see everything. We've got over 10,000 articles on our website, articles and blog posts over the years from back in, all the way back to early 2007 is when we first started publishing. And this one was written over a year ago by Mike Meharry, and he asks a question: who made the Supreme Court king? Well, the Constitution certainly didn't. And it is nonsense. The view that the Constitution means what the Supreme Court says it means, of course, until it changes its mind. And that's the view that too many people hold today. That's why we see a circus around these Supreme Court nominations. That's why people are more concerned with, I don't know, it's all grandstanding in my view. I think a lot of the people who, I think the political grandstanding actually does a disservice to whether or not these allegations are even true. Like, again, I'm not following it, so I don't know, and I can't speak to it with any expertise. But the fact is that if you're in one political team, you think they're true. If you think you're on another political team, you think you don't. If that doesn't say all we need to know about this process, I don't know what does. Matt Hugh, how late am I? Well, I started a few minutes late. We're just about wrapping up here. You'll be able to watch this in the archives. I'm also going to post it over at Twitter, Facebook. We'll probably post a link to our new account over at minds.com, which is a great blockchain-based social media, uncensorable, at least from what I've seen so far. So you'll be able to rewatch this here on YouTube here shortly. I want to thank everyone who's joined us here today. Taco Salad, EHP Training, Will, Mihail, Dan, Justin, did I say you twice already? And Matt, thank you even for popping in near the end here. I really appreciate you being here with me today. These 6 questions from Harry Browne I think are really interesting. Looking back on this article told me a lot. I hope you found it interesting. You found it educational as well. I'm learning every time I do one of these shows, and I'm very grateful for you joining me. I will be back on Wednesday and Friday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time on the West Coast. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great Monday. We'll see you.